On a bitter winter night, in a quiet town, the clang of tools echoed from a small garage lit by a single flickering bulb. Inside, Daniel Brooks, a hard-working mechanic with calloused hands and a soft heart, finished his shift with little more to look forward to than a microwave dinner and a cold apartment above the shop. But just as he was locking up, he noticed her curled up on a bench outside the corner diner, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her clothes too thin for the biting wind. She looked out of place, yet somehow resigned to it, like she'd been battling the cold for far longer than that one night. Without hesitation, Daniel slipped off the only jacket he owned worn, but Warman draped it gently over her shoulders. She didn't say much. Just a quiet thank you and a pair of eyes that lingered on him, as if searching for something she'd nearly forgotten how to trust. What Daniel didn't know was that this single gesture would set off a chain of events neither of them could have imagined. The woman Emily Carter wasn't just a stranger down on her luck. She was a woman escaping a life that had left her disillusioned and alone. A woman who would soon return Daniel's jacket, not only with gratitude, but with a home, a kiss, and a future they'd build from the ground up. This is a story about how one small act of selflessness cracked open a new beginning. About finding love where you least expected, and learning that sometimes the warmth you give away is exactly what the world gives back. Stick around, because Daniel and Emily's story is just getting started. The night air had a cruel bite to it, the kind that cut through layers and lingered in the lungs like smoke. It was nearing midnight, and most of the town had already retreated into the warmth of their homes. But Daniel Brooks was still at work, the hum of the fluorescent lights in the garage casting a bluish glow over his oil-streaked hands. His shift had technically ended hours ago, but he didn't mind staying late. Work was comfortable, it made sense when little else did. He wiped the grease from his hands, shut off the lights, and stepped out into the cold, pulling his jacket tight around him. It was old, the seams frayed, but it had kept him warm through more winters than he could count. He turned the corner, heading toward the alley that led to the stairs, up to his small apartment, when he spotted her. She sat on the wooden bench outside Rosie's diner, shoulders hunched, her arms clutching her torso. A duffel bag rested at her feet, barely zipped. Her thin sweater offered little protection from the frost forming on the pavement. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, distant and tired, and yet when she looked up and their eyes met, there was a flicker of something in her gaze, a shame, fear, maybe a sliver of hope. Daniel paused. He'd seen enough hardship to recognize it, even when it was hidden behind pride. He walked toward her, slow and steady, not wanting to startle her. "Hey," he said gently, voice low enough not to alarm, but warm enough to cut through the silence. She didn't respond right away, just blinked at him, unsure if she should speak. "Are you okay out here?" he asked. She nodded once, though it was far from convincing. Daniel glanced at her bag, then at the diner behind them. The lights were still on inside, but the doors were locked. She'd missed the warmth by minutes. He took off his jacket without another word and extended it toward her. "You'll freeze out here without something heavier," he said, holding it out until she hesitantly took it. Her hands were cold, fingertips red, but her grip was strong despite the tremble. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse like it hadn't been used in days. Daniel gave her a faint smile and nodded. "I'll be just upstairs if you need anything," he offered, gesturing toward the garage. She didn't answer, but she held the jacket to her chest like it was a lifeline. That night, Daniel lay in bed with an extra blanket wrapped around him, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the woman on the bench. He didn't even know her name, but something about her had settled in his mind. He hoped she'd be okay wherever she ended up by morning. He told himself he hadn't done much, just gave away a jacket. But sometimes, kindness isn't about what you give, it's about what you recognize in someone else, and choosing to act on it. The sun rose slowly the next morning, casting a soft golden light across the snow-dusted streets. Daniel stirred from a restless sleep, the chill still clinging to his bones. He dressed quickly, rubbing his arms as he made his way down the creaking stairs to the garage, glancing toward the diner as soon as he stepped outside. The bench was empty. His jacket was gone. So was she. For a moment, Disappointment sat heavy in his chest, though he wasn't sure why. He had no reason to expect her to stay, and he didn't give the jacket expecting it to return. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of unfinished business. He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts aside as he entered the garage. The usual smells of motor oil and gasoline greeted him. His coworker, Tommy, looked up from under the hood of a rusted pickup and smirked. "Hey, Brooks, you look like you spent the night in a freezer," he joked. "Where's your prize jacket?" Daniel shrugged, keeping it casual. "Loaned it out. Someone needed it more." Tommy raised an eyebrow but didn't push. The day went on, filled with the usual repairs and engine diagnostics, but Daniel found himself distracted. Every time the front office door opened, he glanced up, half hoping to see that same woman-tired eyes, quiet presence stepping through. But she never came. That evening, as he wiped down the workbench, he found a few loose threads from the jacket on the floor. He stared at them for a moment before brushing them into his palm. Funny how a simple piece of clothing could hold such weight. The garage fell into silence, the buzz of the day replaced by the low hum of his thoughts. He didn't even know her name, but he remembered her face clearly. The way she clutched the jacket like it was the first warmth she'd felt in days. The way she'd thanked him without meeting his eyes. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't cried or begged. She'd just sat there, quietly bearing whatever storm had landed her on that bench in the dead of winter. That kind of silence said more than words ever could. And Daniel, without quite understanding why, knew that their paths weren't done crossing. Something in her expression lingered in his memory, a trace of a story untold. And maybe, just maybe, she'd come back. Not because she owed him anything, but because somewhere beneath that silence, there was still something waiting to be found. The garage had always been Daniel's sanctuary. Among the engines, socket wrenches, and the steady rhythm of labor, the world outside faded into a hum. But since the night he gave away his jacket, something felt different. It wasn't the cold he'd lived through harsher winters with less. It was the absence of that fleeting moment of connection. The woman's face returned to him in flashes. Her chapped lips, the hint of disbelief in her eyes when he handed her the jacket, the way she had curled into its warmth, like it was the first safety she'd known in years. It lingered like a half-remembered dream, one that left behind a feeling rather than a memory. That night, Daniel returned to his small apartment above the garage, the bare light bulb casting soft shadows on the peeling wallpaper. He reheated leftover chili and sat on the edge of his sagging couch, the fabric threadbare in places, the cushions permanently molded to his frame. The room smelled faintly of motor oil and winter drafts. He stared at the window, as if expecting her to appear again, tucked beneath his jacket, looking up with those quiet eyes. But the streets remained still, dusted in frost, the bench outside the diner empty. He couldn't explain the weight of her absence, not even to himself. He barely knew her, but he had seen enough to understand pain, even in silence. She had reminded him of a younger version of himself, someone lost, trying to hold together the pieces with dignity and grit. Maybe that's why he couldn't stop thinking about her. Or maybe it was the simple truth that, for a moment, kindness had cracked open something in him he didn't realize had closed. Daniel didn't tell anyone about her after that. When his coworkers asked again about the missing jacket, he just smiled and shrugged. "Gave it to someone who needed it," he'd say, then quickly changed the subject. He buried himself in work, fixing brake pads, rotating tires, replacing dead batteries. But each night, as he climbed the narrow stairs to his apartment, he paused at the top, his eyes drawn again to the bench across the street. And each night, it remained empty. A silent promise left hanging in the air. Sometimes, the smallest gestures carved the deepest paths. Daniel hadn't meant to do more than share warmth, but his heart, stubborn, hopeful, was already waiting for something he didn't dare name. Something that felt like it had just begun. By the end of the week, Daniel's coworkers had fully committed to teasing him about the missing jacket. Tommy joked that maybe he'd donated it to a ghost. Lisa, the only one in the shop who didn't laugh at the expense of others, gave Daniel a sideways glance over her mug of coffee and asked gently if everything was all right. Daniel offered his usual answer. All good. But she saw through it. Still, she let it go. People had their stories. She knew better than to pry. Daniel took to brewing coffee earlier than usual, sitting in the corner of the garage where the sunlight hit the concrete floor just right. It was silly, but he kept watching the door, half expecting her to walk in and return the jacket with a shy thank you, maybe even her name. But nothing. The days went on, cold and monotonous. The bench outside remained just a bench. When the end of the week rolled around, Daniel had to admit to himself that she wasn't coming back. She'd taken the jacket rightfully sewn, disappeared. He didn't blame her. Life on the margins had no room for sentiment. But he couldn't help feeling like he'd lost something more than fabric and stitching. On Saturday evening, he passed the diner again, after a long shift. He slowed his steps, heart tugging toward the bench like muscle memory. Empty. He almost turned away when he noticed something small on the ground. A single button. He bent to pick it up. It was dark blue, scratched at the edges, the exact kind of button stitched onto the sleeve of his old jacket. He ran his thumb over it, something stirring in his chest. She'd been back. Maybe just for a moment. Maybe just to rest. But she'd been there. That night, he added the button to the old tin box where he kept bolts and washers, giving it its own place as if it meant something. And maybe it did. A trace. A breadcrumb. Proof that whatever had passed between them wasn't entirely gone, just waiting. It was late Tuesday when the knock came. Daniel had just settled into the armchair with a sandwich and an old repair manual when the sound echoed through the thin walls of his apartment. At first, he thought he imagined it. No one ever knocked. The garage was closed. He opened the door, expecting Tommy or maybe a neighbor complaining about the noise. But it wasn't either of them. She stood there, the same woman from the bench, still wrapped in his jacket. Only now, she wasn't shaking. Her hair was brushed back neatly, her face still pale but calm, and in her arms, she held something in an old canvas bag clutched tightly against her chest. Daniel froze for a second, staring at her as disbelief and relief collided in his chest. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I should have come sooner." Daniel stepped aside wordlessly, letting her in without question. She moved slowly, carefully, as if unsure she was welcome. Inside, the apartment was modest, but warm. She looked around, her fingers brushing the frayed edge of the armchair before sitting down. "I didn't know where to go," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "But I didn't want to keep this." She unzipped the canvas bag and pulled out the jacket. Folded, clean. Alongside it sat a small envelope. Daniel looked at her, then at the envelope. "What's this?" Thank you," she said simply. "And something else. I wasn't just some girl on a bench. I had to get away. From a life that didn't feel like mine anymore." Daniel sat down slowly, the jacket still warm in his hands. She watched him carefully, as if weighing whether to stay or run again. "My name is Emily," she said softly. "Emily Carter." It wasn't much, but it was more than he expected. And in that moment, Daniel understood. The story wasn't finished. Not even close. Daniel turned the envelope over in his hands. It was light, the paper soft and slightly crumpled at the corners. Emily watched him with unreadable eyes, her fingers knotted in her lap. He glanced at her once more before carefully breaking the seal. Inside was a handwritten note, its cursive, delicate but confident. The ink carried more weight than its words at first glance. "For the man who saw Menot just the cold. Thank you. This is not a debt, but a choice. Use the key. It's yours if you want it." Taped to the bottom of the letter was a small silver key. Nothing fancy. Ordinary in every way, except that it had arrived wrapped in a moment he never saw coming. He looked up at her, confusion crossing his features. "What is this?" Emily exhaled, like she'd been holding that breath for days. "It's a house," she said, "just outside of town. Belonged to my grandmother. It's been empty for years. I've been paying taxes on it, trying to keep it from falling apart, but I didn't know what to do with it. I've been running so long, it didn't feel like mine either, until I met you." Daniel stared at the key again, the weight of her words sinking in slowly. He shook his head. I didn't give you my jacket expecting anything. I know, she replied quietly. That's why I came back. She explained that her family had money, but she had left it all behind months ago, walking away from a life of pressure, privilege, and expectations that didn't match the rhythm of her soul. She'd been couch surfing, staying in shelters, sleeping rough when she had to, trying to remember who she was without all the noise. That night on the bench had been a low point. But Daniel's gesture, simple, sincere, had cut through the numbness. I don't want you to feel like this is some kind of payback, she added. It's a gift, but only if you want it. Daniel sat back, the key resting in his palm, warm from his skin. He didn't know what tomorrow held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe he didn't have to figure it all out alone. The house stood just past the edge of town, where the gravel turned to patchy pavement and trees lined the drive like old sentinels. It was small, 2 stories with weathered siding and a slanted roof that needed some love. But the bones were good. Daniel pulled up to the front gate in his truck, the key Emily had given him heavy in his pocket. She sat beside him in the passenger seat, quiet but calm, watching the place with a kind of fondness that spoke of distant memories. He hesitated as he stepped out, unsure if he had the right to cross the threshold of something so personal. Emily nudged the door open and walked ahead, her boots crunching over the dry leaves. It's not charity, she said, as if reading his thoughts. It's a choice. Daniel followed her up the porch steps. The front door creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway lined with faded wallpaper. The scent of old wood and forgotten summers lingered in the air. He stepped inside, letting the door close behind him. Every room held a story untold, a half-curtained window catching the light just right, a set of stairs worn at the edges, a fireplace framed by dusty bricks and stillness. Emily showed him around like someone remembering rather than presenting. She used to make sweet tea in the kitchen, she said, brushing her hand over the counter. And this room, this was hers. She paused at a small den filled with sunlight. I used to read here for hours when I was little. Daniel said little, absorbing the history woven into every corner. The space felt untouched, like it had waited patiently for someone to care again. When they reached the back of the house, he turned to her. Are you sure about this? She met his gaze. You gave me warmth when I didn't ask. A stranger. You reminded me people can still be good. This place was empty, but now it doesn't feel like that anymore. If you want it, make it yours. And in that moment, Daniel realized it wasn't about ownership. It was about roots, a place to stand still, a place to start again. A week passed, and Daniel moved in with nothing more than 2 duffel bags, a toolbox, and a coffee maker. The house was quiet, but not empty, not anymore. He spent the first few days sweeping out the dust, oiling the door hinges, and airing out the rooms. The kitchen became his favorite place, sunlight pouring through the wide window above the sink, warming the counters as he brewed his morning coffee. The scent filled the space, and for the first time in years, it felt like more than just a morning routine. It felt like a ritual. Emily stopped by almost every day. At first, she came with small things, curtains she found in a thrift shop, a bag of groceries, an old photo frame she thought would look good on the windowsill. She never stayed long at first, always careful not to overstep, but gradually her visits grew longer. She'd sit at the small kitchen table while Daniel worked, sipping coffee and sharing pieces of her story, in fragments, memories of a childhood both sheltered and suffocating. Her decision to walk away, the loneliness that followed. Daniel listened more than he spoke. His own past was quieter, but no less shaped by struggle. Parents who worked too hard and loved too little. Years of scraping by, hands in grease and heart on pause. But something about Emily's presence made the silence feel less like emptiness and more like comfort. One afternoon, they painted the hallway together. She picked a soft green. He insisted on doing the trim. They bickered playfully over tape lines and paint smudges, and for a few hours, the house echoed with something new laughter. Later, as they sat on the porch steps with mugs in hand, watching the sun dip below the trees, Emily leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. Feels like a home now, she murmured. Daniel nodded, his eyes on the horizon. Yeah, it does. It wasn't just the paint, or the curtains, or the freshly brewed coffee. It was the sense that this house had come alive again, not just with furniture, but with belonging, with hope, with two people figuring out what it meant to start again, not because they had to, but because finally they could. The fireplace hadn't seen a real flame in years, but Daniel spent 2 days repairing the brickwork and cleaning the chimney. When the first fire crackled to life, the living room glowed in amber light, and the warmth crept into the corners like a long-lost friend. That evening, Emily arrived with a bottle of wine and 2 mismatched glasses, laughing softly at the fancy touch. Daniel pulled 2 chairs closer to the hearth, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping slowly, letting the quiet speak. The fire was more than heat, it was presence, a flickering backdrop to the pieces of themselves they began to offer each other. Emily spoke first, tracing the rim of her glass with a fingertip as she spoke about her childhood summers in this house. Her grandmother, strict but kind. Her father, too busy for hugs, always chasing more. Her mother, distant even when she was near. There were country fairs and secret reading spots under the stairs. And then there were years of boarding schools, social obligations, and a future that had already been planned before she had a say. Daniel listened with the patience of someone who didn't need to fill silence with answers. When he spoke, it was slower, steadier. He told her about growing up in a small house with 4 brothers, his mother holding the whole family together with late-night shifts and gentle words. His father, a quiet man who said more with his tools than with conversation. Daniel had learned early how to fix things: broken toys, old bikes, the neighbor's leaky faucets. It made sense to him. Machines were honest, people were harder. They laughed at their differences and nodded quietly at the similarities. What surprised them both wasn't how much pain they had carried, but how familiar healing sounds when spoken aloud to someone who understood. It wasn't dramatic or tearful, it was easy, honest, a fire, a few drinks, and stories they didn't plan to tell but needed to share. At one point, Emily reached over and touched Daniel's hand, not in a grand gesture, but something natural like punctuation at the end of a sentence. He looked at her, his expression softening with a smile. "I don't know what this is yet," she said quietly, "but I like it." He didn't pull away. "Me too." And so they sat, firelight dancing in their eyes, 2 people no longer lost, just learning how to be found, one evening at a time. Winter had begun to retreat, leaving behind damp earth and early blossoms pushing up through the thaw. The days stretched longer, the air warmer, and the rhythm between Daniel and Emily settled into something gentle and unspoken. She came and went with ease, her visits no longer framed as favors, but woven into the fabric of his days. They worked side by side on repairs, shared meals over mismatched plates, and sometimes on quiet evenings they simply existed together, speaking little, needing nothing more than presence. It wasn't a whirlwind. There were no grand declarations, but something steady had taken root, something deep that grew without permission or need for approval. Still, neither of them named it. Not yet. That night, Daniel had just finished changing the oil in an old Pontiac when Emily pulled into the driveway, her car humming up the gravel path. She stepped out wearing one of his flannel shirts over her dress, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her hair was caught in a breeze, messy and beautiful, and she held a paper bag of pastries from the bakery downtown. "I thought you deserved dessert," she said, holding the bag like a peace offering even though nothing was broken. Daniel wiped his hands and grinned. "Only if you're staying to share." They ate leaning against the hood of her car, the sunset painting the sky in brushstrokes of amber and rose. As the light faded, Emily looked at him, really looked, and Daniel saw the shift before he felt it. The quiet between them thickened, warm and expectant. She set the empty bag aside, her gaze lingering on his face. "You know," she began, voice low and steady, "I never planned on staying here." Daniel's brow lifted. "Here, as in the town?" She shook her head slowly. "Here, as in your driveway, your kitchen, your life." The stillness hung in the air like a breath before a snowfall. And then, without waiting for permission, She leaned in. Their lips met soft, slow, full of the hesitations they had both buried and the trust they had slowly earned. There was no dramatic crescendo, no cinematic flourish, just warmth. Just the quiet certainty of something true. When they pulled apart, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Her forehead rested against his, and his hand found hers. There was only one truth in that moment, and they were both brave enough to let it be real. The garage out back had been part of the house long before Daniel moved in. It was smaller than the one he worked in before, the floor cracked and stained, the shelves empty but full of potential. One early morning, Daniel stood at the threshold, sipping his coffee, staring at the space like it was speaking a language he hadn't heard in a while. He hadn't touched an engine since the move. For the first time in years, he'd given himself permission to just live, but the itch to build was returning. Not just fix, but create. He mentioned the idea to Emily one evening over dinner. "I've been thinking about starting something here. Not full-time at first, just something small." She didn't hesitate. "Then let's do it," she said, as if she'd been waiting for him to say it out loud. From that moment, the project became theirs. They cleaned out the garage together, sweeping away cobwebs, reorganizing tools, and scrubbing years of grime from the windows. Emily surprised him with hand-drawn sketches ideas for a custom car restoration service. She had an eye for design and a quiet excitement that made Daniel see the space through new eyes. They painted the walls, installed shelves, and named the venture Backroad Restorations. It started with a single client, an old friend of Daniel's, who'd been holding on to a rusted Chevy for sentimental reasons. Emily designed the detailing, Daniel handled the engine work, and when they delivered it, the client cried. Word spread fast in the small town. Orders trickled in, more restoration than repair. People wanted their stories preserved in chrome and steel, and Daniel and Emily gave each project their full attention. They didn't just build vehicles, they built meaning, piece by piece, together. Their days are filled with shared purpose and long hours. They argued sometimes over tool placement, over color palettes, but never about the big things. At night, they curled up on the couch, exhausted but satisfied, soothed by the firelight and the smell of paint still clinging to their shirts. Daniel often caught himself watching Emily when she wasn't looking, the way her brows furrowed in concentration, the way she laughed when something went wrong, the way she moved like she finally belonged somewhere. He didn't say it yet, but he felt it. This was more than a life. It was a partnership, one born not from luck, but choice. From two people who met in brokenness and chose to build something whole. Spring unfolded fully now, stretching its fingers into every inch of their world. Trees blossomed along the gravel drive. Sunlight poured through the kitchen in golden waves, and laughter echoed off the walls of the once empty house. What began as a quiet act of kindness had rippled into a life neither of them had planned, but both had embraced. Daniel stood in the garage one morning, hands on his hips, looking over the latest restoration project. Emily entered with 2 mugs of coffee, her hair still damp from the shower, her smile the kind that made the whole room warmer. They exchanged a glance that no longer required words. Their rhythm was second nature now. That afternoon, they took a rare break. Daniel packed a picnic basket, and Emily brought an old quilt. They drove out past the edge of town to a hill that overlooked the valley, where the wind rustled through tall grass and the world felt quiet. Lying side by side under an open sky, they talked about things they used to avoid. Marriage, maybe. Kids, someday. More than anything, they talked about staying, not settling. Staying because this life was one they had made with intention. "I used to think running was freedom," Emily said softly, her hand intertwined with his. "But now I think choosing to stay is braver." Daniel looked at her, the weight of the moment pressing gently into his chest. "You gave me more than a house," he murmured. "You gave me a reason to stop surviving and start living." They kissed again on that hilltop, not with the fire of discovery, but with the comfort of certainty, the kind of kiss that feels like home. When they returned, the house welcomed them like an old friend. The porch light flickered on at dusk. The smell of sawdust and engine oil still lingered in the garage, but everything had changed. not because of what they had, but because of who they had become together. Emily hung a small sign in the kitchen later that evening. It read, "One jacket, one home, one future." Daniel chuckled when he saw it but didn't take it down. Because it was true. And in the quiet heartbeat between that cold winter night and this new beginning, they had found something neither of them expected: a life worth staying for. A life built not on grand gestures, but on one simple, selfless choice.